Good afternoon, everybody. I am Jérémie Labbé, Research Fellow on Humanitarian Affairs at IPI. I am glad to welcome you to this discussion with Dr. Volker Türk, who agreed that I will call him Volker, yes, Director of International Protection in the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, who will reflect on some of the pressing protection challenges concerning people forcibly displaced in current conflict situations around the world. This event today is part of IPI's Humanitarian Affairs series. Those familiar with this series of events know that I usually like to present it as a forum for humanitarian practitioners in the field, especially UN humanitarian coordinators, to meet and exchange with the broader UN and diplomatic community here in New York. However, this series also has the ambition to feature some key policy and decision makers in the humanitarian field in order to discuss some of the current global challenges to humanitarian protection and assistance worldwide. It is in this spirit that our events have featured so far humanitarian coordinators for the Central African Republic, no later than last Thursday in this very room, Somalia, Syria, Afghanistan, Sudan, and the Sahel region, but also last year, Mr. Peter Maurer, President of the International Committee of the Red Cross. It is therefore with great pleasure that I welcome Volker today, who skillfully combines both these qualities of humanitarian field worker and key policymaker. Indeed, besides his numerous UNHCR assignments in various parts of the world, including Malaysia, Kosovo, Bosnia and Herzegovina, the Democratic Republic of Congo, and others, Dr. Türk has recently conducted field missions to Syria, the Central African Republic, and South Sudan, countries that will be the starting point of our discussion today. Based on these recent visits to some of the world's most troubled hotspots, Dr. Türk, or Volker, will tie together the internal and external displacement dimensions of these major humanitarian emergencies, providing an analysis of the type of conflicts we are witnessing today, and demonstrating the continued relevance of a protection response in such situations. In doing so, he will also address a number of dilemmas and challenges humanitarian actors face in their attempts to ensure the protection of victims of conflict, ranging from relocation and humanitarian evacuation to the always challenging but critical issue of humanitarian access. Finally, Dr. Türk will also elaborate on UNHCR's call for increased solidarity and burden sharing in light of an unprecedented number of refugees and internally displaced people worldwide, which, as far as IDPs displaced by conflict alone are concerned, and therefore excluding refugees and people displaced by natural disasters, reached the staggering number of 33 million people, according to the latest data of the Geneva-based internal displacement monitoring center. Volker Türk, who has more than 2 decades of experience with the UNHCR, has been Director of International Protection of the Refugee Agency since 2009. Before that, he held multiple positions both in the field, as I previously mentioned, and at headquarters in Geneva, including Director for Organizational Development and Management in 2008-2009, and Chief of the Protection Policy and Legal Advice section from 2000 to 2004. And prior to joining the UNHCR, Volker had a distinguished academic career in Austria that culminated with the publication in 1992 of his doctoral thesis that focused on, I let you guess, the UNHCR and its mandate. So it is undoubtedly a career deeply committed to the UNHCR and to the protection of people displaced, especially by conflict. So with this brief introduction, I would now like to give the floor to Volker for a 15 to 20 minutes presentation before opening the floor for a Q&A session. Volker, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Jérémie, and thanks a lot for having this opportunity to have a discussion with yourselves on obviously a topic that has preoccupied us for quite some time. In fact, ever since the 1951 Convention was created itself, because obviously the 51 Refugee Convention was created in the wake of the Second World War. So it was clear that the framers of the convention had in their mind the very specific experience of a massive world war that led to a massive, obviously, civilian deaths. But what I would like to, perhaps in the next 15 minutes or so, 20 minutes, provide you with is a very quick overview of some of our recent challenges. And it's clear that one of our biggest challenges is precisely the whole question of what we can do in the humanitarian area when it comes to conflict situations, both when it comes to the most manifest expression of conflict, which is quite frankly forced displacement, both internally as well as externally with refugee flows. And I have had the chance of visiting the most topical conflict situations over the last couple of years, Syria, the Central African Republic and South Sudan, but also some of the neighboring countries, especially around Syria. So I must say I'm obviously very moved by the experience and by the type of work that we all collectively have to do in response. I think there is first a couple of facts and figures. I think it's important to bear in mind if one looks at refugee flows and internal displacement statistics, and you have mentioned one of those statistics that were just recently issued by the International Displacement Monitoring Center of the NRC, the 33 million internally displaced as a result of conflict, that actually the vast majority of displacement today, forced displacement today, occurs as a result of violent conflict. We have not yet the statistics for 2013, but the early indications are clear that the number of refugees will be at probably a continuation of the previous trends of up to 11, if not more, refugees and asylum seekers. So we see an upward trend ever since the last 3 years, ever since compared to the 1989 period. So there's a very clear message here that refugees go back to the time of the 90s, where we have seen massive refugee outflows. And it's clear where they are coming from. And they come from conflict, from countries that are affected by violent conflict in a massive way. I mean, we think that, again, the statistics are not out, but probably today we have about 30,000 people leaving a country, fleeing a country as a result of conflict per day, compared to 2012, where it was about 23,000, and in 2011, about 14,000. So you can see this is a massive increase. But what stands behind these facts and figures? And I think I would like to very quickly look at Syria, CR, and South Sudan. In Syria, I mean, the staggering number of refugees, 2.7 million outside, with over 1 million now in Lebanon, with about 600,000 in Jordan, with over 730,000 in Turkey. I mean, these are numbers that, quite frankly, are very difficult to comprehend, especially for a country like Lebanon that is so deeply affected with its own makeup in terms of making sure that they can host such a huge population. And when I visited Lebanon, I was struck by, first of all, the generosity of a lot of the host communities. I think that's a very striking feature, despite the difficulties. But of course, the impact is enormous on the infrastructure, on the educational system, on the health system, in Jordan, on the water system. I mean, there is a massive impact on these host communities and the host countries. And I don't think it's often appreciated enough, especially when I sometimes hear the discussions taking place in the industrialized countries, where if you get a number of 1,000 arrivals per month, you immediately have all these screaming and shouting about mass influx. I think the comparisons just do not, they're just not comparable. And yet we see also this tendency in the industrialized world where, unfortunately, the asylum systems are often seen as very complex, but are not necessarily responsive to today's realities. When it comes to Syria itself inside, I mean, you have over 9 million people who are in need of humanitarian assistance. You have about 6.5 million internally displaced. You have about 3.2 million who are in hard-to-reach areas, 242,000 in besieged areas. And besieged areas, as you probably saw when the evacuation happened in Homs in January, end of January this year, it really means that people are deprived of everything. And there is an enormous suffering on the part of civilians who are caught up in this type of situations. It, of course, poses incredible dilemmas for us. In an active conflict situation, the type of things that we are able to do and the type of things we are not able to do. And I think, especially when it comes to what protection means in humanitarian assistance and in the way that we are actually delivering material assistance, it's very important to bear in mind that the protection perspective is extremely important to have as at the forefront of what we are trying to achieve, but also to know what the very clear limitations are of protection in active conflict situations. CER, Central African Republic, I think a conflict that has been in the making for quite some time, has been going on for quite some time, with a, quite frankly, and I'm sure you heard it from Abdou Dieng last week, with incredible complexities that are not necessarily immediately visible if you go there. I mean, one of the things that struck me was I almost felt it reminded me of Thomas Hobbes's Leviathan, the situation of a society before a social contract was even crafted, in terms of a war of all against all, because you have no functioning state structures to speak of in a situation like this, which, of course, when you have groups then trying to grab power, becomes extremely dangerous for civilians. And you have coping mechanisms that, quite frankly, among the civilian population that I was really struck with. And the amount of fear, the amount of trauma, the amount of stress that individuals are subjected to is mind-boggling. I had a chance to go to Boda, which was about 4 hours away from Bangui. It's a diamond town, if you like, but this is a bit of a microcosm of the situation there. You have a population of about 5,000 Muslims who live in an almost ghetto situation in this town. There's a no man's land in between, and then there is a community of Christians and also internally displaced Christians, because at some stage when the Seleka rebels came, the Christians were displaced and they were very badly treated. But the amount of hatred between the communities is enormous. And were it not for the French troops, I think there would be a massacre. I think the French Sangaris is actually able, and also Miska. I think in the meantime, Miska has replaced part of the troop deployment of the French. But were they not there, you would have a massacre immediately. I think it goes to some of the dilemmas that we are faced with in the humanitarian community, when it comes to relocation. Because in the absence of a functioning state, with a rudimentary security apparatus in place, with us being confronted with besieged populations of that kind, and with us having the ability to relocate them, certainly as a measure of last resort, and because of an immediate life-threatening situation, I think we do not have much choice but to do it. I know it's been very difficult. I know that there are lots of complexities around this subject. I know that some people think we shouldn't have done it, but quite frankly, I don't think that there is much choice but to undertake such operations as a measure of last resort, and with the sole objective of saving lives. And it has happened a couple of times in the CER, and I think in each and every of these situations, it is justifiable from a humanitarian imperative and from a protection perspective. I'm just mentioning this because it's certainly a dilemma that has often been discussed. South Sudan, similar situation. I mean, and it's very sad from a UNHCR perspective to see that, because we have been with the South Sudanese people for decades. We know generations of South Sudanese refugees who we helped in get on with their lives in exile for sometimes long time, for decades, as I said. We have helped about 1.8 million South Sudanese refugees return to their home country, so we were all very thrilled with the prospect of a peaceful future for them. And you can imagine our sadness about the fact that we have now again an outflow from South Sudan. We have about 340,000 refugees again from South Sudan as a result of the events after 15 December last year. It's again a very complex conflict. It's a conflict that is a political one at its base. Unfortunately, it has unleashed some of the ethnic issues around it. It has probably a much deeper level of complexity in it as a result of that. And it's certainly a conflict that has, if it's not resolved quickly, and while there is some hope with the ceasefire agreement that was reached a couple of weeks ago, that if it's not reached, there will be massive displacement. FAO has already sent out its warnings about a possible famine, and the planting season is, if people cannot plant, it will obviously lead to disastrous consequences on the humanitarian front. So I'm just describing these three. What I thought I would quickly do is to highlight some of the common elements that I see emerge, that I think are common elements in this type of conflicts, and I think I should probably stop, that I think are important to bear in mind when we talk about protection and conflict and responses to that. The first one is civilian. I mean, there is this element of civilians and the civilianization of conflict. I think it's clear, and it has different dimensions to it. First of all, it is civilians that bear the brunt of it. They bear the brunt of violence and conflict. And you see that certainly in the statistics when it comes to displacement, because these are civilians mostly. You see it also in terms of who actually gets injured and gets killed. And then let's not forget that there is also huge infrastructural issues that get destroyed as a result of conflict. I mean, I was quite struck by driving from Damascus to Homs, where you see a lot of damaged housing and infrastructure that would take quite some time to build up again, and some almost empty landscapes. So the fact that civilians are particularly affected and not necessarily armed elements or soldiers is certainly, I know it's an element that has been described quite a bit, but it's something that is very striking. But also civilians as perpetrators. And sometimes you have this phenomenon because of the creation of self-defense groups, because of the creation of militias associated with various parties. You have this element of people, sometimes out of self-defense, sometimes for other reasons, who may be civilians during the day, but may be rebels during the night. Not necessarily in uniform, but they may actually be in combat, engaged in combat activities. And I think this blurring of lines, which perhaps in the past was clearer between you have an armed group, you have combatants, you have the armed forces of a state, I think that distinction is definitely blurred in all the conflicts that we currently witness, these most active ones. The second element is protractedness. If one looks at statistics again, we see a steady decline in refugee returns, which is an indication, and last year I think it's about, we haven't got the exact statistics yet, but it's about 400,000. So we see of refugee returns. So we see a steady decline. We see a steady decline in refugees having the comfort of feeling that they can go home. So meaning that they feel that the situation hasn't changed enough for them to be exercising their free and informed choice about where and what type of life they would have, which is an indication that conflict continues. So you have almost a cyclical, protracted intractability around conflicts. And that's very worrying, because you have almost generations growing up with violence and in this type of circumstances. And healing, obviously, is very difficult when you see and are exposed to this cyclical areas of violence. The third point, multiple displacement. Syrians, when they come to Lebanon, Turkey, or Jordan, have already been displaced a couple of times inside Syria. A lot of the Central African refugees have already been displaced twice before they reach Cameroon or Chad. The same with the South Sudanese. So we see displacement is not just a one-time event, it's a process, and it becomes almost a way of life, a way of survival. But it has incredibly disruptive consequences for the individual and for the lives of individuals. So, and that's something we sometimes forget. We just hear displacement figures, but we actually don't see that there is a lot more behind that. Fourth, conflicts do not lend themselves to simplistic categorizations. I think sometimes we hear too much about, well, this is just political, this is ethnic, this is religious. It's not quite like that. It's much more complicated. I mean, if one just looks at the Syria issue and the Syria context, I mean, there are many elements to it, many layers to it. There are many actors. There are many facets to that one needs to analyze very carefully if one then wants to craft a humanitarian response. The same for CER, the same for South Sudan. And sometimes climate change issues come into play as well. We did some in-depth interviews with Somali refugees a couple of years ago, where we asked them about how they have experienced, before they came as refugees to Kenya, how they have experienced changes in the environment. And they actually said, well, it wasn't environmental degradation or drought that pushed them out, but it was the combination of drought, environmental degradation, the incapability of the state to respond to this that pushed them out. And of course, then the consequences when it comes to governance. So I think it's an interesting area that one shouldn't forget. Fifth, fragmentation. You have, as I was saying, with this blurring of distinction among civilians, you have an increasingly fragmented environment in all the situations. Syria has, what's the estimate, 1,400 armed groups at least. There's no central command of one group versus the other. There are many groups. The same in CER, because you have of course Seleka, Anti-Balaka, but among them and different groups are around this. There are many motives. Sometimes it's repression, it's fighting for political change, it's ideological motives, but there is also sometimes opportunistic criminality and criminal motives that come in. And it's again part of, because you have a lawlessness situation, of course, people benefit from that as well. There is the war economy and the logic of that comes in. Sixth, persecution. And I'm saying persecution because when we often hear the term conflict refugees, especially in the more sophisticated asylum systems, there is a tendency to say, well, they are not quite 1951 Convention refugees because they are not persecuted, it's just generalized violence. Well, obviously, from a UNHCR perspective and from the analysis of any of the conflicts that we are talking about, we are talking here about persecution on political, ethnic, religious, or whatever grounds. So it is not just an indiscriminate generalized type of violence. Very often it is targeted. Very often people are singled out. Very often it is done precisely to either harm a particular group or to get at the opposition. So I think one needs to bear in mind that we are talking here about the core of what the Refugee Convention is about. 7, impact on children is enormous. And in all these conflicts, it affects education, recruitment, very often child recruitment in all 3 conflicts. It is an issue of destruction of schooling, of infrastructure, incredible psychosocial impact, family separation. We have an increase in unaccompanied minors on the move. Actually, there are children on the move and they are unaccompanied. Even the US is affected by this. The numbers have gone up of children fleeing, especially very difficult violent situation, gang violence in Honduras, in Central America. ending up here as sometimes asylum seekers. So you see a clear children on the move, and that's again a manifestation of deeper reasons that are behind it. 8, erosion of law and principles. I mean, obviously war and conflict is it's always an issue where you have a lot of things that happen that shouldn't happen, but there is definitely a much stronger tendency towards ignoring international humanitarian law, international human rights standards. And in some instances in Syria, for example, IHL is not even recognized to apply by the parties. So you have a huge issue of even the basic recognition that international humanitarian law should apply. That's fundamental in these circumstances. And then I have 2 more points, and then I'll open it up. I mean, we can open up. I mean, the 9th point is the absence of the state and impunity for violations of IHL, international human rights law. I mean, probably not uncommon, but it is, for instance, striking in CR to see that the state is so absent, especially outside Bangui. And that's really, I mean, a massive issue if you do not have a state that has functioning structures in place. There are no prosecutors or prisons to speak of that could actually respond to violations and perpetrators. So you can imagine, if you have such a situation, what this means if there is an ongoing conflict. But we also have in stronger states, or even in middle-income countries, we have parts of the country, Colombia is an example, where you have parts of the country where the state is just not present, or not present enough, which does invite then a chaotic, anarchic situation, which leads to the violence that we see, again with the impact on the civilians. And the last point, humanitarian action and the danger of politicization. I think especially in the type of conflicts that we see, where political solutions are very difficult, and there's no doubt about that either, there is a tendency then to focus on the humanitarian aspects of it. And the tendency to politicize humanitarian action becomes ever greater. And I think it's important to bear that in mind, because it's important not to do this. Obviously, we would say that as humanitarians. But there is that danger. And we have seen that that's an ongoing thing. We have seen it certainly in the 90s in the Balkans, but we see it also today in some instances. It's very important that the humanitarian community cannot resolve the political problems, the underlying causes of the conflicts and of the displacement. We are not equipped to do that. That's not our job. At the same time, it is also important that the space that we have as humanitarians is preserved for us to be able to do our job. In too many situations, we are the lifeline of whole populations. There is too much of an expectation put on the humanitarians, too much of a burden sometimes of what we can do if the state is not functioning, or if other parts of the response are not functioning, including on the political side. And I think it's important to preserve the fundamental principles upon which humanitarian action needs to be built. And there is a bit of a blurring of that. And it's a tendency one has to watch very carefully and to resolve. I think that's sort of, these are some observations. I mean, there's obviously much more to talk about, including about the need for solidarity, because I mean, I wanted to really finish by saying, well, what we really need, obviously, is a lot more of a multilateral approach and solidarity and international cooperation to ease the burden on host countries. I mean, Lebanon, for example, to ease on Turkey, Jordan, all these countries around Syria, but also the countries around South Sudan, the countries affected by the Afghanistan crisis, the countries affected by Somalia, the countries affected by Cameroon, Chad, DRC, that are affected by these prolonged conflicts. We will not be able to keep the protection and the asylum space for people who are in desperate need if we do not have that international cooperative and international solidarity mechanism in place, which means very concretely funding and help and assistance and recognition of the displacement problem in the first place. So, thank you.
Thank you very much, Volker. Before opening the floor to the participants here, I have tens of questions to ask you, but I will limit myself to one. And reacting to this listing of the similarities in terms of challenges for humanitarian protection and assistance that you see in those different, in current situations of conflict, what are or what should be the key priorities for the UNHCR? I don't know if they're identified yet or if you have to make this up here with us. But could you tell us like 2, 3, or 4 key priorities in terms of, in order to ensure increased protection, particularly of people forcibly displaced, that would allow addressing some of the challenges that you just described?
No, I think there needs to be very clear recognition that refugee protection is a coping response that needs strengthening. I mean, if we look at the numbers outside South Sudan and what I've just described at some length, refugee protection response is a response that needs to be respected and where the borders have to be kept open, but then also where the solidarity has to come in on the part of the international community to support states that do that. There's an enormous generosity. Yet that generosity cannot last for year after year after year, especially if countries are affected by these massive influxes, as we have seen, especially as a result of the Syria crisis. So this humanitarian notion of providing that type of assistance is certainly one of the key aspects. But it's not just about funding and development projects and so forth, but it also goes about just being aware of what this means. Resettlement is an option. I mean, we have launched a major program for resettlement and humanitarian admission of Syrian refugees. I mean, 30,000 this year is the hope. 30,000, you can say, is nothing compared to the numbers, but it's still a symbol of an important measure of some solidarity. I mean, we hope in 2015, 2016 to actually resettle 100,000 Syrian refugees. And again, nothing compared to potentially 4 million refugees, but it's still important, and that includes us all. I think the second priority is to stop the erosion of the principles. I mean, well, obviously as a lawyer or as a person who comes from a protection background, we think that principles are important. I think we need principled. We need sometimes pragmatic approaches. One doesn't exclude the other. But I think we need to know the principles. We need to know the principles well before we can depart from them, because there may be very exceptional situations and dilemmas. I mean, the Homs evacuation scenario was one, where the principles may not be applicable in the way that they are supposed to be. But then we have to think through the consequences if you depart from them. And so this principled yet pragmatic is an important element, but it's important to bear in mind the principles. Perhaps the third one is this, which I think we sometimes in the humanitarian community don't see early enough, is a solution orientation right from the beginning. I mean, that we already think of the women's groups that are out there that could potentially be agents of peace. That we already, right from the beginning of a displacement context, think of the type of the impact that conflict and violence and displacement has on children, and already start our responses to that right from the beginning, that we think of solutions right from the beginning, that we know how the conflict has evolved, the type of obstacles that are put out there, that we bear that in mind, that we do not, in the midst of the turmoil of the displacement, that we do not forget already the possible future that must be a peaceful one. But what does it take to get there? And I think these are sort of three main areas I would highlight.
Thank you very much, Volker. So I'd like now to open the floor to our participants. I'd like to remind you of a few basic rules for this exercise. Please first mention your name and affiliation when you take the mic. And I would also appreciate, if you are not too shy, that you stand up so that we can see you. Keep the microphone steady as well, because we are recording this or webcasting this event, and for the purpose of good recording of your question as well, we would like you to keep it really steady in front of your mouth. And please keep your questions or comments relatively short. Thank you very much. So I will start with one question there at the back, Hilde from the Norwegian mission. Then I will take a second one here, a third one here, and we will, if it's fine with you, we'll take three questions at once and then come back to you. All right? And then I take note of. All right. So Hilde.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much for your presentation. Norway is a very strong supporter of UNHCR, and we appreciate the work you do for protecting refugees and internally displaced. Sorry? Oh, Hilde Klemestad, Mission of Norway. Sorry. I appreciate your last comment on women's groups. That's also a high priority for us. I wonder if you could say a few more words about the politicization of humanitarian assistance and action, and the importance of principles. There are, like you said, a lot of dilemmas attached to that. For instance, when the UN assistance in Syria, most of it, almost all of it, goes to the government-controlled areas. That too is the UN really not applying the principles. And we, of course, understand the dilemmas, but if you could say a few more words about that. Thank you.
Then we'll take a second question. This lady there, yes.
Thank you very much for your presentation. I'm Yvonne Lockhart-Smith, and I work with the UN Secretariat. My question, it's partly related to that, but as very concrete, one of the key difficulties which you underline in your presentation regarding forced displacement today is the fact that need for long-term relocation is becoming obviously something that it's within the remit that you need to address the UNHCR. Specifically in the case of Syria, when you look at Lebanon with 1 million people and deep-seated fears regarding refugees, I wonder how the UNHCR is dealing with the political sensitivities and complexities about long-term relocation for those refugees. Syria is just simply an example, but you can perhaps elaborate on general terms. Thank you.
Then Warren wanted to ask a question. The mic is coming here.
Warren Hogue, IPI. Volker, thank you for that presentation, which is so dramatic. One of the most dramatic things you said, and it was haunting when you said in Car, were it not for the presence of French troops, there would be a massacre. And that leads me to ask you, what do you do when the only protection for a group, an ethnic group, a religious group, is to relocate them? If you do relocate them, you in effect are committing a form of ethnic cleansing, are you not?
All right, thank you very much. I spotted 3 additional questions, so we'll come back to you for additional questions. I see that we have a lot of interest in the audience, but I will come back to you first. Would you like to address those 3 questions?
Well, thank you very much. I think indeed the issue of, we actually in UNHCR we have an approach which we call age-gender diversity approach. Which means that in our programming, even before we start, with the planning process, when we sit down and try to figure out what are the priorities of the communities, we have this participatory approach where we sit down with different groups, women groups, with girls, different age groups, boys and men, to actually sit down and have a discussion with them to find out what is it that they need. And a lot of the priorities that sometimes we as bureaucrats think is what is needed are getting very quickly demystified by actually sitting down and having these discussions. I was very struck by one particular, and I'm just mentioning this perhaps by way of an anecdote, by one meeting that I had with Syrian women in Turkey, where I asked them, and they were very strong. I mean, they obviously were in a very difficult situation in a camp, trying to figure out what their future is, seeing whether they have contact with their relatives at home. Were very worried about the education of their children, in particular, about their future. But they were saying, I was asking them, have you met in this way before? And they said when they were back in Homs or in Hama or in Aleppo, and they actually didn't. So it's the first time in the displacement context, so there's not just bad news, there's also good news. You actually see almost an empowerment among women because, not least of the displacement experience, because of the type of problems that they face, where they, in a way, have developed this strong bond to address the problems that they face, and I found that very interesting. Just politicization, you see, and maybe that goes a bit also to your question about relocation. In a way, I would like to use it around this relocation issue in CER. There is a communities at risk strategy that the humanitarian actors have worked out under the lead of the protection cluster, and I don't know whether Abdou Dieng was talking about this last week. So if we identify communities at risk, and it could be Muslim, it could be Christian communities that are, if you like, beleaguered or be besieged by another group or by these armed elements. Of course, it's important to do whatever you can to resolve the community rift. I mean, to actually talk to the communities, to see where they stand, maybe even with humanitarian assistance that is given on both sides, that you can start having some confidence built. But there are situations, and actually in Boda, I heard that in the meantime, there seems to be some sort of dialogue that has started between the communities. So it's not that relocation is always the immediate response. It's not. It's really the last measure response. So there are a number of issues that can be done before that. But if we, as a humanitarian community, are faced with the dilemma or this hard choice, and I think it was, to be honest, Bosangoa was the example, where we had 500 Muslims in Bosangoa. When the Chadian troops left, we were extremely worried about the security of the people, because the Chadian troops left basically from one day to the next. And the assessment of the people on the ground was, and I saw some of the very dramatic emails that they wrote, there's a huge ethical dilemma for people who have been dealing with this population for weeks. What do? I mean, they fear that the troops leave and then they will be attacked and killed. So there was not much choice but to say we have to find a relocation option for them to get them out, which in the end they did. They got attacked on the way. Once the people left this École Liberté, it was totally destroyed. There was sometimes mosques, for instance, are totally destroyed after people leave. So the amount of hatred is enormous. So in this type of situations, I think we don't have much of a choice, really. And yes, there will be, and that's why I'm saying sometimes I hear then that from a political perspective, one shouldn't do this because it contributes to ethnic displacement or ethnic cleansing or this, that, and the other, or it contributes to the partitioning of the country. But quite frankly, on the basis of the principles that we have, the humanitarian imperative to save lives, we cannot do anything but that. And that's really a horrible dilemma. I think no one wants to do this, but if it's a measure of last resort, in order to save lives, I don't think we have much choice. And that's a little bit where I sometimes say, because I hear then that the government at some stage wasn't happy with it, and we hear other countries were not happy with this, but quite frankly, if you're put into this situation, what can you do? And I felt with the staff that were calling us desperately, because they were really, they were deeply traumatized by what they saw, about what they feared, and I could feel this myself. So quite frankly, there I think we have to go back to the principles, and the principles would say the humanitarian imperative prevails, even if it may lead to all kinds of unintended consequences for which we do not have control, over which we do not have control over. On your issue in relation to Syria, actually, it's a very complex issue, obviously, the humanitarian operation inside Syria. And this whole debate about cross-border and so forth. We did, and it's because you have very fluid front lines. You constantly have to negotiate. I met with the UN country team. I obviously know Jakub, the humanitarian coordinator, the RCHC there. I met our staff, and I mean, it is a constant struggle to identify ways and means in a very active conflict situation of this kind with so many different groups to actually negotiate humanitarian space here and there. And I think the statistics are that we managed, and it's always an interagency context. The humanitarian response is not just UNHCR, it's obviously done within an interagency context, and we are part of that. We managed to, I think the statistics is, we managed to distribute, for instance, 2 million core relief items since the beginning of the year, and about 20% was across lines. The fact that in April, UNHCR was able to have in Aleppo a ceasefire agreement across the line, and we had about 4 hours where we could go in and distribute, this shows the difficulty of the realities on the ground. I mean, it's not for want of not wanting to do this, that, or the other. It's just, it reflects what is going on the ground, and I think one needs to bear that in mind when we talk about a situation such as the one in Syria. Then the question about maybe the long-term relocation and what the solution is, quite frankly, there are not that many solutions. If once the situation becomes better in all these contexts, and if indeed the conditions are there for people to return, we will engage on return, on voluntary, what we call voluntary repatriation, both in the internal context as well as, for refugees. In none of these situations, in none of them, there is at the moment a prospect for return that we would be able to support. And I think it's clear why. But it doesn't mean that this may not happen. It will have to happen in any case, including, by the way, for the Muslim communities who are currently in Chad or Cameroon. I think we must not give up on, at some stage, having discussions with, maybe once there's a more robust presence of a DPKO presence soon in CR, that we actually start putting the building blocks there that would create, again, conditions of return. Reconciliation will have to happen as a result, peaceful coexistence projects, and these sort of things. And I think I responded to your question.
Thank you. So I will take another round of 3 questions, starting with Evelyn down the 4th row, then one question here on the 1st row, and another one down on the 3rd row on the left. So starting with Evelyn from Oxfam here. Thank you.
Thank you, Jérémie. My name is Evelyn Roymans. I'm with Oxfam International. You were mentioning the increasingly protractedness of conflict and of IDPs or refugee situations. Is there any evolution in thinking and in practice on what to do and what can be done to empower these people that are in situations for decades, basically, to build their resilience, to build their economic power, and also what thinking is going on, especially in terms of empowering women in such situations? Thank you.
Hi, I'm Catherine Dumay-Harper. I'm an independent humanitarian consultant, but I used to be a former representative for MSF, Doctors Without Borders. Thank you very much for your excellent presentation. I will argue with the protection of military presence. Sometime, as we know, for the past 20 years, not necessarily help the people. I mean, avoid massacres, yes, in some cases, but not when you see in DRC, for example, very recently. But anyway, my question has more to do with the impact The fact that UNHCR is part of the UN political organ, and you are under certain rules of security, and when you have to withdraw, so when other organizations, NGOs or ICRC stay on the ground, but you have to withdraw. So that's my question, what you do in terms of efforts. And to go back to Syria, yes, that's obviously, do you have any international presence now in the non-governmental part of Syria? Are you tied up with the Security Council resolution or not in terms to have access to the other part of non-governmental control areas? And if you could just mention if UNHCR is working in Myanmar or not, I would appreciate, because the conflict in Myanmar, in Burma, with the Rohingya. Thank you. Because there is presently massacres there. Thank you.
And then we'll take a third question, right there, and I will come back to you after the next round. Down the left-hand side, or my left-hand side.
Thanks. Excuse me, I'm Karen Colvard from the Harry Guggenheim Foundation. I'd like to hear something more about criminality among refugee populations. We know this can be related to the distress or the deprivation of warfare. Sometimes crimes committed have to do with conflicts and histories that resulted from back home, and they're just opportunistic. But these crimes can be robbery, they can be rape. They tend to be relatively hidden crimes compared to massacres and things that happen in the open. Now, I'm wondering if UNHCR has any sort of police-style capability for prevention and reaction to these kinds of crimes, or for adjudication of them, or if UNHCR has a practice of encouraging ad hoc type governments that can arise in enclave cultures like refugee camps.
Thank you. So I still have two questions at least on my list. We'll come back to you after. Oh, you wanted that we? Okay. Then Joe on the second row right here.
Thank you. Joe Donnelly from Caritas International. A question, Dr. Türk, in addition to saying thank you very much, great presentation. How many times have you been in CAR through the years, and then this most recent trip, in terms of grading your sense of how bad it's gotten and where the level of community disintegration has occurred? And then relative to that, despite all the talk about the religious leaders' platform and much talk, and they were sitting up here with us not long ago, your perception of the role of religion right now amidst a really intense ethnic conflict. Thank you.
Thanks. There is one door on the right, on my right-hand side, who is first, and then there will be another one. Do you want that we go for all of them? Yeah? All right. Wow, it's bold. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Michael Bliss, I'm the political coordinator at the Australian mission on the Security Council. And just a couple of Security Council related questions and one comment, which I'll start with. Obviously, a lot of discussion about the inadequacy of humanitarian access in the Syrian context, despite Resolution 2139. We will be receiving, of course, the third monthly report under 2139 from OCHA next week, and Australia, Jordan and Luxembourg, as the co-authors of 2139, are working on a follow-on text which will seek to take that a step further. So that's just a quick update on council action, which is relevant to the discussion so far. The question is, given your concerns about shrinking humanitarian space in complex and fragmented conflicts, how can council authorised protection provided by peacekeeping operations, and we're going through exactly this discussion now in relation to a revision of the UNMISS mandate in South Sudan, in which there'll be three pillars in the new resolution, one of which will be very specifically providing protection to humanitarian actors. How can we authorise that in a manner and have that that mandate taken up by the mission in a manner which nevertheless still retains some humanitarian space within which UN agencies and other humanitarian actors can work? A difficult one, but be interested in your views. Thanks.
I think we do have a last question. Dar, yes.
Yeah, it's nice to be last. I'm Brian Gorelick, Volker. Thanks for the talk. 3 points. One is, the UN's coordination response. How's that going, if I can just put it like that? Because these are huge crises and there's a number of actors on the ground. Number 2, are the resources, I know they're not enough, but how much are they not enough? If I can put it like that. I know there's various pitches for what the requirements are, but what are the requirements? I like, once upon a time, a former Deputy High Commissioner made the pitch to say, we're short like 60% of what we would need, and let's stop kidding ourselves. If you can put a sort of figure on that and address that. And then thirdly, it's terrible, it's tragic, it's getting worse, which is really not what we would like to see as people on this earth. But it is. But there's also a toll on the other side, and that's people working in these emergencies, the humanitarian workers, the NGO staff, etc. What's the toll on the humanitarian workers who are in these God-forsaken crises? And what is the UN doing about it?
Well, you have a pretty full plate, I believe. I took good note of all the questions, so I can help you if needed to remember all of them. Please, the floor is yours.
No, I hope I did the same, Jérémie. On the first question from Oxfam on the protracted and what do we do about this, we actually, and I think that's really where there needs to be a bit of a paradigm shift overall. There has been a tendency to think that displacement solutions can only be resolved through return. And I think it is really important to look at solutions more broadly, especially if displacement has been prolonged. We usually say it's after 5 years that a situation becomes protracted, but sometimes we talk here, Afghan refugees, for example, I mean, they have been in exile, some of them, for 20, 30 years. To actually work on other solutions than return and to support host communities, to find ways and means. Iran has a very interesting project now on using even labor mobility schemes within Iran where people can get work and get their passports from the Afghan consulates, where you actually try to, this is not integration, but you normalize or stabilize populations. And I think it is upon us all to think creatively about the type of solutions one can provide. I think the other point is, especially refugee camps, which is not necessarily the right response in all circumstances. I mean, in fact, we have a whole policy of trying to support much more refugees and IDPs outside settlements or outside camps, as you know. But in some of these instances, if you go into refugee camps that have been there for a while, you actually get the impression that these are cities or villages, and why not have that recognized as such? Why not benefit then from the development work in the surrounding areas that would make these locations viable development locations where the resources would go in? And I think that often is a political issue, because governments may not want to recognize this officially, despite the fact that they may actually benefit from it. So on the solution side, we have a number of initiatives planned, including a solutions group where Oxfam, by the way, participates. There is precisely to make a stronger link with development actors, with the World Bank, with other actors who can have hopefully step in and find solutions other than pure return. And women in all of this obviously play a very important role. I mean, we still see not enough women participate in peace processes, quite frankly. And I wish that we, and that's self-critical of ourselves, I think that we ourselves in UNHCR become more sensitive to that as well by actually making sure that the rights awareness of refugee women is also something that is more pronounced from the perspective of looking towards the future. And I think it's certainly an area that we would like to work on further. The question of MSF and the difference of action, and we often look at you with envy, MSF and ICRC. Well, but we look at MSF and ICRC with envy because we see that you can do things that we, for various reasons, are no longer able to do, which we perhaps in the past were able to do. Although I must say there has been also a paradigm shift within the UN. I think there is a much greater awareness of, also from the security perspective, ensuring that we are able to stay and deliver even in very complex situations. It may not be enough. It may not always be what is required. I think it is also important in that respect that one makes a very clear distinction between the humanitarian actors of the UN and other actors, which is why we always emphasize, I mean, within the humanitarian community, the necessity to respect the independence, impartiality, neutrality of the humanitarian agencies such as ours. I mean, UNHCR, UNICEF, WFP, OCHA, and so forth. I mean, these are obviously the humanitarian actors, and we do not want to be confused with the more political side of the UN. I mean, sometimes there are crazy confusions. You know, we are seen as almost replacing member states. So, I mean, all of this we have to be very careful about. Then the issue of Myanmar. Yes, we have been present in Myanmar for a very long time. In fact, I think it even goes back 3 decades now. Thanks, Udo. It's clear that we are also present in Rakhine State. We have a very clear mandate in respect of this particular population, not just from the aspect of refugees from Rohingya refugees outside, but also from the perspective of statelessness. And we hope that within the current process in Myanmar that this issue can be resolved, because it creates still a lot of problems outside. We see the Rohingya movements from especially Bangladesh, but even from Myanmar towards Thailand and Malaysia, for example, Indonesia. A lot of loss of life at sea in the Bay of Bengal, which is very concerning. Then the colleague, criminality. Yes, you mentioned criminal. Well, we are always at pains to explain that refugees are not any different from a normal population. So I don't think, in fact, the statistics that we have, to the extent that we have them, would actually indicate that refugees commit much, I mean, the crime rate among refugee population is much lower than the normal population, because of course refugees very often are in a much more vulnerable situation. So there is a clear duty that the 1951 Convention imposes on refugees. They have to abide by the local laws. They are subjected to the law enforcement of their host countries. So criminality, I would not see is an issue among refugee populations. In fact, it's of course, SGBV is an issue, but it's an issue that is it's not perpetrated necessarily by refugees. It's often perpetrated, unfortunately, also by law enforcement personnel in some of the host countries, by host communities, and that is indeed an issue. I mean, we have a program for access to justice of women, especially in the context of sexual and gender-based violence. We have some interesting programs, for example, of mobile courts, and mobile teams where we fund or help governments to send mobile teams to remote places in order to ensure that access to justice is guaranteed. So, but I would be certainly not want to have you get away with the impression that we have a criminal problem among refugee populations. Most certainly not. The issue, I think, from Caritas. Well, it's my first visit to CR, so I cannot compare from my own. Obviously, we have followed the situation in CR for quite some time. I mean, what I heard from local observers that the community disintegration has obviously started certainly as of last year, since March last year, and has accelerated over the last couple of months. I think the religious leaders have a role to play in all of this. And I heard of some quite worrying instances where religious leaders, and I won't say who and what, but where I heard that they actually did not necessarily do the right thing. And there was almost some type of incitement to hatred of sorts, or it didn't help in this context. So I think there is a worry. We actually organized, and Deepika will be very happy if I say that now, we organized a dialogue, the High Commissioner's dialogue on faith and protection a couple of years ago, 2 years ago, where faith leaders themselves developed a paper in very impressive language. I don't know if you saw that. It's the welcoming communities are welcoming the stranger, which we actually use in this type of context, in the refugee context, but also in the internal displacement context. And I think it is indeed a document that we hope that faith leaders would subscribe to, not least in this type of situations. The Security Council Resolution 1239 is obviously one that is very important. I was in Syria at the time when it was adopted, and I was part of a discussion within the UN country team to see, how can we use this now, and what type of leverage does it give to us? And I think it's a tool to ensure that indeed one can work with the various parties, with the government, with the other parties to the conflict on humanitarian access. The problem is of course an active conflict situation, and there are lots of barriers to it at the end of the day, and we keep feeding to the reporting of the Secretary General to the Security Council on 1239, which is important, in the hope that the parties to the conflict take their responsibilities very seriously when it comes to providing, and especially humanitarian access and the facilitation of humanitarian aid. And I think your question about, perhaps on a more broader basis, about integrated missions and the interaction between the humanitarian and the integrated missions is again a very important one. It is very clear that in a number of instances, the security side of things needs to have a clear idea about protection of civilian issues. And I think, and I understand that, especially for the military, they are not used to community policing, for example, because that's not their job. So the community policing side and the CIFPOL side, we often see in many of these situations where there's a lot of need that needs to go in precisely and to do multi-ethnic policing and so forth. And I think the UN has a lot of experience in that regard from Bosnia, from many situations. In most of this type of situations, when there's also a certain lawlessness, the community policing and building up local structures that can do that, because at the end of the day, it is local ownership of these issues. But where the international community, where peacekeeping missions can provide that type of support is extremely important. One cannot, especially in a situation like Syria, like South Sudan, I think there is a desperate need for this type of support of the local structures. The last question, that's Brian. Coordination. Well, there is an enormous stress on all of us. There's no doubt about this. We had Valerie Amos keep saying 4 L3 emergencies. And we had the Philippines, Syria, South Sudan, and Syria over the last couple of months. And that's an incredible strain on everyone. And on all actors, on the humanitarian side, on the political side, and so forth. And coordination is obviously a very important part of it, and it's one aspect that has improved over time with various transformative agenda and so forth. Clearly, the other big challenge for us is also to ensure the delivery, but also to ensure the delivery in contexts that are so fraught with complexities, such as the Syria context and so forth. And when it comes to that, one of the complexities is the lack of funding, quite frankly, and we are underfunded in all these operations, not just UNHCR. I think I'm talking about the humanitarian community at large. WFP has huge issues of funding, for example. I think the Syria response is about 24% at this stage. I think South Sudan, CER is between 10, 15, something like that. I mean, I don't know what the Oslo conference has changed now in terms of, so the humanitarian component is greatly underfunded because the overall humanitarian funding that governments have at their disposal is not commensurate with the need. So you need to really do something desperately for that. And part of it is also that the development actors in the context of Syria, for example, will need to come in massive ways on the transition issues, on infrastructural issues for Lebanon, Jordan, for even in Egypt. And I think the whole machinery for that and the funding for it doesn't seem to be there in the way that it should, because there are too many strains. Yes, and it does affect all of us, and in particular the ones who work under extremely difficult circumstances in often very remote and isolated locations, CR and so forth. And I must say a lot of the humanitarian staff risk their lives. We see this with MSF, with ICRC, we lost a colleague 2 weeks ago in the Central African Republic. He was brutally murdered in Bangui. So that's unfortunate. I mean, I think in Syria itself, from the Syrian Red Crescent, they had, I don't know what the exact death toll is, but when I was there, they had lost about 46 of their staff. It just shows that humanitarian action is not necessarily always seen as one that protects the lives of the ones who are actually there to provide that assistance. So there is a lot that still needs to be done. Thank you.
Well, Volker, congratulations for addressing or responding quite systematically to not less than 10 questions, I think. So congratulations. I will take the privilege of the chair to ask you one final question that I hope will provide a good opportunity to conclude this event. I remember when I was in Geneva approximately a decade ago, there was a lot of discussion among some UNHCR colleagues who I was meeting from time to time about this imbalance within the UNHCR between its emergency assistance component and its protection component. Some of your colleagues back then complaining that somehow following the 1990s crisis, the UNHCR had put too much emphasis on its capacity to deliver assistance in crisis to the detriment somehow of its capacity to ensure the protection of refugees, asylum seekers, and other peoples of concern, as you call them. How is it today? Would you say that the UNHCR has reestablished this balance? And as Director of International Protection, I think you're certainly a relevant person to whom to ask this question.
Mm-hmm. No, I would certainly think so. I think we have a High Commissioner who is extremely dedicated to protection, and I think over the last 9 years we have seen a huge increase both in terms of the way that we deliver on protection within the humanitarian response, but also in terms of staffing. We have, for instance, and the High Commissioner himself is personally engaged with these strategies. We have a massive strategy an updated strategy on our response to sexual and gender-based violence, on education, which is a 5-year strategy, as well as on community-based protection, which are new approaches, and on child protection. So there is, I think, not just in terms of our approach and the way that we deal with actors and our stakeholders, but I think there's also programmatically a very strong response. I think we are an agency that lives the culture of protection and puts protection at the center of who we are, what we are, and the way we deliver. And I think the best embodiment of that is actually the High Commissioner himself. I think he has been very, very clear about this, both in deed and in action.
Well, Volker, thank you very much indeed for being with us today. And I would like to thank also all the participants for your active participation in this discussion. Thank you.
Thanks.